So I took this topic to have a little investigation more into the question of what is a score, and then to come in, after a while to the topic of improvisation, and electronic music probably is omnipresent. So what is a score? Score is something which can either document or it can enable. So these are the two main directions a score is. We have to think what a score can be. A score translates always. So we know that a score is doing a lot of things, but it translates data, and I come a little bit later to this expression of translation, because there's much more behind translation. What means translation? What is the purpose? Because purpose has a lot to do with what a score is. It's very important in the score not only what is there, but as well what is not there, to understand the purpose or to understand where is my degree of freedom, because the present data tell me what I have to do basically, and the missing data tell me what I can decide on. So the targets of a score is, it's about abstraction, because it needs to reduce data, it needs to simplify data, because when you see a real frequency, you don't know what to do with it. So the frequency information, so the resulting sound is overcomplex. It's never something we can relate to somehow. Except a little bit with the ear we can relate to, but with this information, visual representation of amplitude representation is completely useless. So what a score is basically doing from this point of amplitude, it's doing the abstraction, it's doing the reduction and simplification of data. It gives them information for performance, and it gives information about time and pitch, or structure and timbre. It's about readability, so we have to read and understand, being able to understand many information or subtract or condensate the most important information. And it's about identifying gesture and gestalten, or gestalt, singular. What we finally come up with, these are some expressions: a graphical score, a realization score, listener score, physical score, sonic score, let's say conventional score. So these are specialized score types which are existing. And now this is a pre-reflection about what we are going to talk about, but now let's go into the concrete, into the specific score types. So this is a score and I would call it's the black dot problem. Everyone thinks he knows or she knows what this score is supposed to sound, but if you think of what is there, it's first of all, it's a black dot in certain lines. What does it mean? So we have, for example, the idea of the mapping of a certain position of the black dot to a certain pitch. But there already it starts. Is it a well-tempered pitch? Did Bach have the same well-tempered scale than the one we are using currently? So even the information of pitch is quite relative. When you have a sung pitch, it's different than a piano pitch, than a string pitch, because the interpolation between the notes are different. So it's really the extreme minimalism of information, the minimum of information of music you can get. It's, like I said, it's a black dot assigning a position roughly, not saying anything about interpolation. So what happens between between note 1 and note 2? There's no information about it. You see this little trill in parentheses. These information, as we know, were often not at all displayed. They were traditionally taught. and no information about speed. Okay, in poco allegro, that's a little bit of information, but in the beginning there's no information of speed, and there's no ritardando, accelerando, no information of dynamics, no information of timbre, also instruments used. It's really very minimalistic information. And we all think we know what this music is like. And the score doesn't tell it. It's only the tradition which tells us what kind of music this is. So this score is not music, one could say. It needs a lot of added information to become music. And as well, this score is called in KI, artificial intelligence, it's especially important, it's called symbolic data. That means a meta information. No, that's not a sample. Each sample value, it's a label of sonic object. Let's call it like that. Now let's go to the next step. We know all there's a lot of Bach scores around in MIDI. They are public available, but when we see MIDI, which is another type of these scores, it's just a score with a different representation or different purpose. We think we have this, for example. It's not the Bach piece, but it's a piano roll. But with MIDI, we even don't have this because we have only information about MIDI on and MIDI off. They are completely separate. So even in MIDI, we don't have an object of a note. There's only an information about which note on and which note off. And we have no information about duration. So the object of the note, the duration is not existing. That's interesting. Especially in artificial intelligence, you have to add on exactly doing what this program is doing, add on the duration to make a identifiable note object. Another score. So the red element is basically the score which plays the rest of the code. And usually the code definitions are not there. It's a Sonic Pi score, and the definitions you're using, sometimes you see them while the performer is creating these definitions. Sometimes you don't, but here you have to understand that the part you play is the red one, but the part you need to play is the white code. So you need the white code to generate the result of the red code. This kind of subclasses. You know, in PD it's the same situation. You have multi-layers, which you somehow have in a normal score as well. You have a score and then the instrument, which is a different layer of complexity or information. But as well, I find interesting in this that not only code, but as well the score, so the abstracted representation of sound is used as a communication material, a communication method. In live coding, the reading of the code is part of the perceptive process. It's not only listening, it's about reading the score. That's an interesting role of a score. And it's an interesting role of computer code as well. Because that's the only, I think that's the only situation in which computer code is part of the concert. Usually it's not, you don't see it, it's not displayed. So this is already an improvisation technique, a score technique, and yeah, that's both aspects which are important here, and have the sonic result. Some fractals, sound structure, just as a add-on to this, that this what we see is sounding. Now we have the information of used synth piano. That's the instrumentation, and all the other information are basically inside this code. So when you have the organization of time and pitch of Bach, you have a similar thing here. You have the complete organization of time and pitch. But of course, with a different purpose and a different looking. So here is the PD example. Now we touch another level of score, which is something you would call a graphical score. It's the question if it's still a symbolic score, because we have symbols, but we have symbols of different types, as well as here in this score, as in the former. Here we have programs like A level. That's a program. Here in PD we have similar programs which do things. And we have the same structuring level of multi-layer, hierarchical structuring, where sub-information are inside one of these boxes. So we have a multi-dimensional, basically multi-dimensional score, which is somehow present in most of the scores, because we have usually the big distinction between organization of sound, let's say metadata, organization of metadata and timbre sound. These two levels are usually separated in the score, which they are not here, because this patch is creating the timbre and the metadata. Interesting. So what is the purpose of this score? This score is not there to represent the sound, but it can be seen, it can be used as a documentation of a piece of music. It can be used as a generative tool to create the music. And it's a graphical score somehow, because through the graphics it's displaying context structures. Something similar is this doing, this course, but we have at the same time, we have a similar language aspect, a graphical element, but on the same time we have here a completely different attitude, because this is much closer to the Bach score than the PD score we had before, because nearly no or not a lot of information are presented. It's very highly abstract. It doesn't say anything about sound, except if there is a preliminary page explaining the way you have to deal with this. But the information of sound is not present here. It's even, you can see, it's not even the information of pitch, because we can assume that the height of the position is mapped to pitch, but it may be not. You may even turn the page and read it that way, or you can define high pitch are on the lower side of the page. So that's as well a score which has a highly improvisative element. It's not very specific, but it's this openness is its special purpose. So openness means always there is something you can do as a player, as a musical player, which is not described by the score. And here as well, there might be as well some aspect of this openness, which will come later, which we'll revisit later. And that is in case there is an input-output information. Then in that case, the PD patch is something similar. It has a random element, because we don't know what's coming in from the microphone. So it only describes what it does if there is a input channel included. It only describes what you have to do with the incoming signal, but not what is the incoming information. So an openness, open part again, with a highly random element, and this random element will be in 100 years completely different to the random element today. Graphical score. So probably most of you know Yannis Xenakis' Phytopracta. It's an orchestra piece. It's we have here the original score, but it's not very easy to understand what is going on. It's the same piece, a different representation, and I think a very clear way to represent what is going on in the piece, much better than the former one. So what's the difference between the two scores? One is one is a score for the orchestra, and the other one is a score for the reader, for the person who is listening to the music, for the listener or reader of the score. So one is a description of what each of the player has to create, and one is an abstraction of the information which being present in the score. And as I said before, of course, what is more readable, what is easier to understand, of course, the left side. And why not? I mean, why could the orchestra not use the left, the score on the left side for the creation? I think this has to do with a lot of traditional behavior and conventions instrumentalists are used to deal with. But it could be, we could think of that each musical player is drawing out a certain line he's going to follow in this score, doing something than the real score is doing, except for the fact that maybe the pitch are not definitely or very precisely defined. But the organization, the movement of the pitch might be reproducible or from the left score. So here it might be the question, what is the better one? The more open score or the more defined traditional score? On the first view, this seems to be something similar. It seems to be the same, but it's completely different. I mean, if you see this representation on the left and this representation, because here it's this score here is both at the same time. You can read it and understand what's going on, but it's for the UPIC. For this device, Xenakis has created, which is translating visual information into sonic information. So what you see here is a pitch structure, and it's exactly the same what you see here. It's as well the pitch structure. You could even probably put this pitch structure into the UPIC and have Phytopracta translated artificially. But that was not the aim of that score. So this score is there to be somehow read by the machine and be translated in a certain domain, and that means pitch. Yeah? So it's a graphical score, of course, but it's a machine readable. It's a machine score. And now I have another idea of a physical, something which I would describe as a physical score. So what we see here are two strings, and some of you might have heard of that. That's a physical model from Acroé. Genesis is a software called. And if you have a certain equations, just Newton laws of mechanics, then you have the sublayer behind this, and you have certain, let's say, parameters which are not displayed here, but we probably certain numbers which we would need to display. And then we have something which is describing exactly the result, the sonic and the time result. It is I would say it is the best way of sonic compression possible. So what you create with this is a virtual movement And this virtual movement translated into air pressure movement is the sound. I have some more examples because I like them so much, and I want you to participate a little bit in this fascination of this idea of a score, which is generating movement, and this movement is generating the sound. Because I think this is a score which contains everything. There is no interpretable data inside. Everything is described by this score. So an extreme. And here bowed string, a bowed kind of cello string, which is turning slowly into a flageolet because of the pressure of the bow. And of course, the speed of the animation is sliced basically, so that we can see the movements somehow, as the real animations are, of course, 440 hertz per second. Here another one. So and so on. This example I wanted to include because it contains not only sonic information, it contains as well gestural information of time. So this representation is not only about a sound object, like one note of a string. It as well has a continuous phrase of music. It contains a phrase of music. And then, of course, you know this one. This seems to be a similar thing, because this is all the data basically read out of a sound, and with an inverse FFT. You would recreate the sound, but as I said, it's a representation. So the other example before is a score which generates the sound, and this is interpreting or visualizing the result. Even though both are containing complete information about the data, the amplitude here, the amplitude and the FFT data, both are, let's say, after the creation of the sound, interpreted and created. So it's a bit a different situation. And the other aspect is it's a good visual representation, but the other aspect is this contains much more data. The amount of data is much higher, so there's no abstraction somehow, because this is the data itself. Now I come to the different aspect, which is a hybrid score, which is used and optimized for readability. And in electronic music, we a lot of time use this FFT or the amplitude representation to understand, to have at least a timeline, to have our orientation of dynamics or timbres. But our eye cannot really understand so many or interpret so many details of the data out of the FFT and the amplitude. So we need, on top of it, some information which especially the acousmatic music, which has no need of a score creating for the sound creator, for the instrumentalist, but it has a need for data to understand the structure of a sound, of a piece of music. So a meta level of information we would call analysis is added with a certain purpose of interpreting. And this interpretation of data or of sonic material, of course, is quite subjective. We usually say if it's done by the composer, it's a valid interpretation. If it's done by someone else, it may follow a different intention. So in this case where not the composer is doing such a representation, might be focused in a different way than the initial piece is doing. So this is, like every analysis, this is very much purpose-driven. Here's another score you might know, which is hybrid as well, because the electronic part is basically displaying the phenomenology of sound somehow. So what is going on in the sound, or certain parameters are are represented in the tape part, while the instrumental part is, of course, represented as black dots and or many additional information about dynamics and speed. So this kind of hybrid is always there when you have an instrument plus some electronic, and you want to give the musician some orientation about what and how to relate to certain sounds in the electronic part. This I already started to refer in the beginning, sound with an independent input frame. That's very interesting, because this is a score which is extremely precise, but it doesn't say anything about sound except words. And you know how specific words can describe sounds. Cage described what kind of sounds shall be used for certain of these families, and you have to go and record these sounds and put on tape, and then, or on a DAW you would do it today, and then you construct or reconstruct the piece. You construct the piece, I would say. So that was the initial idea. That means the input is really, it might sound 100 years ago completely different than in 200 years, when I don't know which bird is dying, will be extinct at that time, so that bird sound will not be existing and not surrounding us. Now we have motor cars. In 100 years we might have only electronic cars, electro cars, or whatever, other cars, hydrogen cars, which will sound completely different. So this score has an open input. It's only telling this is the frame of a sound. This is how I do a fade in, a fade out. This is the duration, and this should be the family of a sound, but not. It doesn't say what is the sound. It tells a certain order, but it has really a big open interpretative part, which makes it interesting, because that means we could every, let's say, 10 years, or if you're living in South America or in Germany or in France, you would recreate this piece and it would sound differently. So it has a challenge of absorbing the time this piece is realized in. Here the same, I mentioned this already, here the same in the PD or max patch, where you just define a frame. This is what has to be done with a signal, but I don't know what the signal is. And it might be interesting if you compose a piece like that and you say, I don't tell you which input sound you might use. Just place it here or there, or the only description is what is done with the sound, and not what is the sound which is processed. And last but not least, I will come to a project I will finish in 2 weeks. Very proud of this. We will publish a book about the Hub, and they do something very interesting, because the Hub is a group of people which started as the League of Automatic Composers in the Bay Area, and later the Hub, and they work as a collective with improvisation and electronics, and they have a very strange way of creating pieces, and that is, for example, here. We wanted in this book to document all of their scores. So this book contains all of their scores plus additional text. And this is one example of the score. So I'm not sure if you give you a little bit of time to read so that you have an idea of how such a piece could be created. So if I turn your attention to the last sentence, all other sound parameters are open to play a choice. So it gives basically a structured description of what's going to happen, a description about who is sending, who is receiving, about what the receiver has to do with information, has to do with information he's receiving. In this case, I must say he, because there was no she included. Then this information is processed. There's no information about the duration of the piece, so there are a lot of information missing. But the interesting part is that you can do this with a completely different tool set. You can, as they did it, you see the year that was 1989. They had, so I should have displayed a picture of their devices they're using, just like something like a Raspberry Pi or so. They use a very simple computing element which include network connectivity. And today you would do it with your laptops, you connect them through Ethernet, you have a much higher speed of information, and then you do it with PD or Max or some other software, Super Collider you want to use, and then you can reproduce the score with modern means, with modern tools. And I think here the strength of this course is this simplicity, this reproducibility, not for all the scores, but for many of them, and let's say the inspiration such a simple idea might give. This is a second example I want to display. So they did it usually in this way. One or two of them had an idea, and then they implemented the idea, gave it a title, and came to the rehearsals and just tell it to the others and say, we want to do today this and this and that. And then they performed practiced it basically in their rehearsals and presented it during a concert. And this is probably not what you would expect or what you would see as a score on the first glimpse. It has nothing to do with the first score of Bach. It's a lot of text. Most of the time, no single pitch is mentioned. Just saying that you should could or should use pitches, but you can look which one you would like to use, and then it tells you what you have to do with it. Yeah, with this I would like to end my little talk, because I think we have already gone through a lot of inspirational examples of score, of what a score might be, and this is so important, I think, and with this we can much better understand what music is. The simple example in the beginning of Bach, we don't need so many, we don't need a complete description of all parameters. But sometimes it might be useful, might be interesting to have all descriptions, like with a physical model. It might be interesting. But we can play in between these spaces of extreme tiny description of something, inspires you to make something very interesting out of it.
So thank you, Ludger, for giving us an overview about what scores could be and widening probably our impression what is a score and what we may not have thought of as being a score before you introduced it to us and said, well, this is also a score. I would like to open the discussion for any contribution or any questions from the audience. No questions? There's one.
So is the score basically a framework for the players, or how can we put them all together? Because I wonder, is a game also a score in a way? Because we have certain rules and the players just can fill in with every idea they have, and they can, for example, solve the puzzle with ideas they have. Is this music as well?
Of course. I mean, the score for players mustn't be. I mean, I try to give you, let's say, many examples of different roles and different existences of a score, and with the example of the physical model, there is no player involved. It's only the only player is the one who composes the score, and all the consequences are done by Newton laws. But the example you mentioned, of course, that score type is made for players, filling basically the gaps of information between the information you have to make a sonic result.
Yeah, I think we can also imagine scores without visual or narrative representation. For example, in Max Patch, that was a visual representation of the score, which is a visual representation of something that is inside the computer that doesn't need words. So a score can even be a patch.
Yeah, you can think of a score being everything. It's an interesting idea of a score being something non-visual. That's interesting. I mean, what is this? Wie heißt das nochmal? Nein, das der rhythmische, rhythmic information where you give sometime click track. Yeah, the click track, for example. That's interesting. It's close to audible score. Yeah, it doesn't say you so many things about what you have to do, but it says something about organization of time.
But it's funny because when we present it, then we have to make a visual representation of that again. So when you show the max patch and then the other score, which was 1-to-1, then it got one layer distance. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, every score has a hidden layer, like the Bach, which is the hidden layer is the information which is not present, and that's for example, the audio time elements, which are not represented at all. It's only probably in the pitch information. That's the only information relating to the audio time, to the time faster than 30 frames per second.
Sorry, I speak a lot. This is super interesting. The Bach piece has also a lot of information because it's similar to other music that is created in its time. So we would acknowledge this as representative for the era that is created in. So it's a lot of things that are understood in it, where you can't compare that to a new score without that context.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a lot of contextual information which is for us taken for granted. For example, the air, for example, if the score is sounding underwater, it's a completely different sound. If it's sounding without any air, of course we don't hear anything. It's optimized and to our listening, to our ear. And if you think beyond that, you could think of a score which is for non-humans or in a different, which can be thought in a different context.
I guess, shall we start? Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to find out. Thank you very much for the overview. It was very, very nice to see also some new examples I didn't know. We were like, as I made a little talk before, we were like kind of experimenting with these languages of forms. So especially from the visual department. So what does it mean to make a Hörpartitur out of something you listen, and then what does it mean when a visual artist does something with it, and maybe then you give this as a score to a musician, you know, so what is still in there? So maybe there are some things which you didn't know that they exist still in this translation. But another experiment we want to like to do, with the installation out there, we had an experiment with a jazz saxophone player who was very amazed by this thing and want to improvise with this. And then there comes this idea that there's one, I don't know if you tried it out, so there's one stage where you can have a form which is very similar to your physical model, where you can really kind of read the frequencies when you see the form. So it's a pretty amazing form, but it's still like building up by the frequencies. And when he played that, then we got the idea that it would be interesting that he plays this form with his saxophone and doing a duet, and somebody else, another saxophone player, just only see the form as a live score and plays with this live score of the other saxophone player, not hearing it at all. But the audience will hear like both saxophone players. And what happens then, you know, when you kind of have this live situation of scoring or kind of live score interpreting what maybe is there as a hearing experience which you don't hear.
Did you do this already, or do you have this in mind to do this?
We want to do that with this.
Yeah,
that's
so
it.
My question would be, was the public satisfied? There was the public.
Didn't you say it doesn't interest you as a composer?
No. I'm interested in
I think it would be very satisfying for sure.
Michael.
Yeah, I came in late, so sorry if it's maybe a bit off topic, but something a little bit bizarre for me occurred to me while you were talking, particularly because you were talking about more open to interpretation scores. It occurred to me that notation as we know it on 5 lines with blocks and stems and things like that is often perceived to be something which fairly rigidly defines what musicians have to do in order to achieve the musical composition. And yet we all know that there's so much implied in that notation that players bring so much to a score that when you hear just that score played back by a computer, it's not the music at all. Yeah? So there's an awful lot that musicians bring to the score, to the music that's not in the score. At the same time, if you take the idea that a score tries to define everything that needs to be done, a piece of computer software, whether that's a MaxPatch or a Common Lisp program which generates music, which generates all the notes or events in a piece of music, that can also be seen as a score. We know from certain environments like C-Sound that indeed there are scores, things referred to as scores, which are note lists. You know? But in the context of what you were talking about before, it occurred to me that they're not scores at all.
Well, I showed an example of live coding scores.
No, my point is that the code is then not a score because it allows for no interpretation. It's absolutely rigid. I wonder
Yes.
how
Yes.
it's a bit of a bizarre thought. I've always thought of my code as something similar to a score.
Well, if you see a notation of Pierre Boulez, there's much less rigidity than in Bach, for example. So it's not by definition that a score has to be blank parameter space.
Sure.
So it can be, and you have to know what is. And this is what one of these aspects I want to draw the attention to, that what is not there. What is not there in the score, because everything what is not there is your freedom of interpretation.
Yeah.
And everything what is there is, you have to think of how it is displayed at all. Yeah, for example, in the Bach score, the interpolation between two notes is different from a flute, with a guitar, with a piano, with a voice. So there are certain conventions how these information which are there are performed.
But do you consider your Common Lisp code to be a score?
Yes. Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that there is no room for interpretation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it's this duality of scores, because
Yeah.
scores could be used as something to communicate to a musician and make a musician do something with it that we call interpretation, and that fills all the gaps that necessarily were left out, because otherwise it might be unreadable. And on the other hand, the score is something for the informed reader to read. I mean, there have also been scores, especially in Renaissance counterpuntal music, where things are hidden in the scores that you wouldn't be able to hear, and as a musician, you don't really need it to play. I mean, the fact that one has the score like this and the other one has the score like this, and it played together works fantastically. Something that you can appreciate as a reader, or things that many composers have hidden in their scores, not for the player, not for the listener, because they just couldn't perceive it, but for the reader, or maybe for God, or whosoever. And there's a duality in the use of score. And in this context, I think a Lisp program or a program in any program language or MaxPatch is some kind of a score for some informed reader. Someone who could read Lisp could understand more of your music than the listener perceives when he just hears the music, because he knows how things fluctuate.
I just want to make this obvious point that we should probably discriminate clearly between score and notation also, right? So notation, I would say, implies this idea of translation.
And interpretation.
Yeah, because as usual we haven't defined any terms so far. So but notation might help in that.
If you have an orchestra score and you sit in a concert and you read the orchestra score, you don't need to read the score in order to play something, because you're not a player. So this score can be both at the same time. Yeah, it can be the instruction set for the player to play something, and it can be for a listener the additional information of analyzing what's there.
Yeah, but the Schrift, right? The translational system exists because it was meant to bring the piece into to translate it into sound.
Well, not only maybe.
But that's why that score was produced.
No,
No?
the conducting score was not produced for the player. It has probably wrong transpositions. It's for the conductor or for the reader. It was not. No, I've never seen a music player in an orchestra using the entire conducting score for.
Okay, but that's a derivation of the same thing.
There's also the score for the reader, which is so small that you
Yes.
can conduct from it because it's just small.
Yeah.
My
Yeah, Hans is there.
Yeah, we need to look at the intention also of the composer for writing a score. So some scores are clearly meant for more practical reasons, that it's possible to decipher what the composer means, and the composer might have a really clear idea about all the parameters in the music. Other scores are supposed to be more open and artistic and inspire, like the scores by Cage or Christian Wolff or people like that. So we need to look at those distinctions as well. So some scores are deliberately being artworks themselves, like visual representations that are artworks, and other scores are as practical as possible.
Yeah, I wanted to say something similar to Maya. In the instrumental field, where we need the scores to do the pieces, or we are asked to do the pieces and get the score, there is this, since Lachenmann, there is this distinction between Aktionsnotation and Resultnotation. And so if there is written what I do, it's not at all a documentation of for the reader, for the listener. It's a documentation of what I do, and maybe you hear something else. But if it's a notation of the result, then it should not be so much open to interpretation and creativity, because theoretically what is written there should be guaranteed by the player. But maybe for you it's different in electronic music.
Yeah, but that's what he said. I mean, the things that are not written there are still open to the player.
Yes.
Like in the Bach example.
Yeah, I think this course we also have to think about the word of precision. What is the composer's intention? How precise the score needs to be interpreted? And what is the composer's acceptance of liberty? And that might vary quite a bit across all these examples you have shown. I think about another example by Mauro Lanza. He gave musicians an auditory track on headphones. Nobody else would ever hear than the players, and they had to react to it. And I think about one piece by Jean-François Charles. He recorded people laughing, and he played that to the players and just gave the instruction, okay, react to it. And both were never actually heard by anybody, not read or not printed. So we probably could think about scores also as an organizational device, helping the players to create their part with the amount of openness the composer wants.
It sounds like pretty much a writable definition of what score might be.
Something that I think in your presentation was very, very comprehensive, was perhaps implied but not directly said, is that for any score to be understood, there is a code that has to be deciphered. If the reader, performer, whoever, the listener, does not know how to read that, the score is useless. And I think that's a very important point when we are in this kind of a lot of students here that may actually try different kinds of scores in the future, that perhaps are innovative and all that, that provided that they give the key to their players or people that they can understand what they're doing with things very much explicit or a lot of freedom, but at least to know what they have to do, because if not, we are reading anything, but we don't know how to interpret it. If you give a score to somebody who doesn't read music, a normal score, he will say, oh, very nice drawings, but I have no idea what to do with it. And that's exactly what may happen with more advanced scores of that. So I think that the code is important, that the code has to be known at some point, because if not, we are in the unknown, and that has to be, even Cage playing pieces that are very, very much free to interpret, gives you a bit of a cue or a clue how to actually confront them and do something with them. No? So that, at least that little key has to be there. I think it's important to take that into consideration. Yeah.
Michael?
So
Following on from that, then you have to ask yourself, what is the role of notation with mixed works, where there's an electronic component and an instrumental component? We all agree on the code for maybe inscribing what instrumentalists do, but there's absolutely no agreed code for describing what electronic musicians do. And this is what leads some practitioners like Richard Barrett, I believe, to correctly assert, in my view, that almost all of these mixed works involve a high level of improvisation. Because the electronics, if there's any kind of interaction with the electronics, if it's got a tape part, then it's not notatable really. You have to improvise it to quite a large degree. And this calls into question the whole future of our compositional activities and the role of notation in those.
And to tell the players what they have to do or not, or what is the frame of freedom that they have while they are actually facing those pieces.
Yeah.
I think the question is also the amount of instruction. Everybody knows that above all the conventions you learn somewhere, you have the instructions in the score which seem to show something which is not conventional, for example. And even if you make the combination with electronics, of course you need something in additional to that. What is the time-based score? Just to show what you want to show, or what you want what you want to show of electronic score. If you do a mixture piece with instrumental things, I think the instrumental score it's well known. Meanwhile, I think even action notation and these things, but the combination with the electronic things, it should be therefore also a mixture of all these we were talking about. You can also, if you have just a tape, you can of course see the sonic tape or the sonic instructions there, but you can also write some text about the realization, how you should play with it and these things. I think it should be a mixture of very precise instruction, not only in the time-based score itself.
I think the example that you showed. Okay. The example that you showed for William Mix, for example, if you don't know that those are tapes and how they are cut, it's very difficult to understand what it is. But the moment you know that, it's very easy to then replicate that score, not with the same sounds as Gage did, as Larry Austin did in the 2000s, that you made the Williams remix, and actually you made the categorization of sounds, recorded new, and then made it exactly replicated the score with new sounds there. But you have to know exactly that that's it. If not, it's a lot of drawings there that you don't know exactly what they mean and what they do with a couple of words.
Me first? Okay, I have a question. You said earlier that the score can also be for the listener to read and understand what's happening, analyze the music. And I remember that I once played a rather complicated piece with my orchestra, and to make it easier for the reader, there was a very long description and analysis in the program book for the reader to go along. And after the concert, several people told me that they really liked the piece of music, but only because they read what it was about. They read the description, and could that be categorized as a score as well? Since it is for the reader to go along and analyze.
Should boil down to a program of scores?
Depending on if they describe the piece of music, and not just the thought behind that, could that be categorized as a score?
I think everything which is a kind of representation of the object, even it might not be a sonic object, everything which can be a representation of an object can be called a score.
I also think it's important to think about the relation from the composer to the interpreter and to the reader. And I think more and more, and there were a lot of scores in the past, that you have a really clear sense who's the composer speaking to. So there's the score is part of a collaboration of something that you agree on, you make a a structure with you, you make signs, and the other one knows, but it's not a complete code. So afterwards, it's maybe unreadable. It's this kind of score was a momentary thing in a process, and afterwards it's unreadable. So I think these scores are also something that's really an important part, that we have a lot of scores more and more that are in part of this kind of processes and disappear afterwards.
No.
Yeah. I remember also before when Gamma, Tuno, that is the Norwegian Gamma, when we had to make scores to present the music in Tuno, in Gamma, in order to have it qualified as work, you know. So we made scores out of things that didn't need a score, just for that purpose. You probably did that in Germany too, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
We all did.
All the time, so if there's nothing essentially anymore to add to this discussion, I would like to thank Ludger for this inspiring talk on scores and what scores and what not scores not, and what they might be useful for and what maybe not. So, thank you very much.
Can I just say something too? I might have added this at the end, but I'll say it now because it'll give us time to react to this maybe. First of all, thank you to the students who have helped a lot with providing the food, carrying things around, and doing all kinds of jobs. You all helped us really an awful lot. I'm really grateful. If you didn't get it. Thing is, it's not only a 50-year anniversary, we have two 60-year birthday boys amongst us. And Thomas. Really, is that so awful? That's over 60.
No, 50. They are 50.
Both very well known here, loved by the students, both are celebrating their 60th birthday, so maybe that's why I mentioned it now, not tomorrow. Might be an opportunity to buy them a drink or something to console them.